And now we will continue with a mock lecture. You get to experience a lecture now, again by Professor Drummond. Of course, it's not a full lecture. It's going to be only 15 minutes. We have to finish at 4 p.m. with a mock lecture. So try 15 minutes maybe.
Well, I may stretch that 15 minutes a little bit if I may, but I'll do my best to comply. Okay, so
and the title will be "Can we feed the world and still save the planet?" So
yes, so
Drummond,
hopefully
your classroom is yours now.
Okay, so hopefully you can now see the. Okay, sorry, a bit of a delay there. Okay, so can we feed the world and still save the planet? So what is this about? Well, today I'm going to tell you about feeding the world, and then we'll look at how this relates to agriculture and land use, agriculture and climate change, and finally we'll look at a few innovations to try and meet some of the challenges I will describe. So feeding the world. Well, as I'm sure you all know, humans need energy from food to survive. And to put it in perspective, the UN thinks that as an absolute minimum to prevent starvation, we need about 7,500 kilojoules of energy from food each day. And that's equivalent to about 1.4 kilos of cooked rice. And as I'm also sure that you're aware, the world's population is presently almost 8 billion people and is rising. And it's expected to carry on rising through the rest of this century. And one prediction is that it might reach 9 billion by 2050. So to feed all these extra people, we will need an increase of at least 15% in the amount of food that's produced. Now, I'm not the first person to predict a problem from needing more food because of increasing population. So way back in the 18th century, one person called Thomas Malthus predicted that since the population was growing faster than the food supply, then when the population exceeds the food supply, people will starve. Later in the 20th century, Paul Ehrlich in the 1960s said that by 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any programs that begin now. So in the past, there have been several predictions that the world's population was going to reach a crisis point where there were too many people, not enough food, and the population would decline. But obviously, from the graph I've just shown you, they were wrong. World population continued to grow despite these scientists' predictions. So what was the reason for that? Why were their predictions wrong? Well, the answer was, of course, that farming and agriculture managed to increase the level of food production. And there are two main ways in which this has been achieved. So the first way is to simply increase the area of land used for agriculture. So as human populations move from living in natural ecosystems through hunting and fishing, gatherer type cultures into settled farming, generally the area of agricultural land, the area used for urban settlements increases greatly, whilst the area of natural ecosystems declines. And you can see this in this chart here showing area of land use over the past 2,000 years, with a large increase in cropland and grazing. So in part, we can explain the increase in production from the areas of land that's used. However, the increase in area of land used for agriculture has not been enough to provide food for the number of people now living on Earth. So if we look at this chart, which shows percentage increases against time since the 1960s, the area of land used for cereal production hasn't changed much. The population in that time frame has increased to 150%, and cereal production has increased as well. In fact, it's increased more than the population has increased. So what has changed? Well, the change has been in what's called the yield of cereal. So that's the amount of crop that can be produced from a particular area of farmland. And how has that been achieved? Well, that increase in productivity has largely come from the use of nitrogen fertilizers. And it's thought that in the world today, about half the world's population is now fed by synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. Any of you who've studied chemistry in high school might have heard of this Haber-Bosch process developed at the start of the 20th century, which converts atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia, which can then be used to fertilize crops. And without that, only about half the world's population would have sufficient food currently to survive. The rest of us depend on synthetic nitrogen fertilizers to produce our food. The second effect of this has been that the actual land use for crop production hasn't actually changed greatly in the past 50 or so years, but additional land would have been required again if we hadn't used nitrogen fertilizers. So to summarize, there are two main ways of increasing food production. One is to increase the area of farmed land. The second way is to increase the crop yield, the amount of crop that can be produced from a given area. I now want to move on and to look at some of the effects and of using these different methods of increasing agricultural production if we're going to increase food production to feed an increased world population. So this map is a little bit strange because it's colored in different areas of the globe based on areas of land use. So it's really a way of giving you an idea of how much land in the whole world is used for a particular activity. So if we look over here, you'll see that most of Southeast Asia is covered by this pink color representing cropland, whilst North and South America, there's an area equivalent to both these continents used for livestock production. So if we want to increase the amount of land used for agriculture, we need to find another source of land. And that can't come from this area here, which is shown covering most of Western and Eastern Europe, because that is what's called barren land. It's not very fertile, not suitable for crops. It can't come from the shrubland, which again is usually unsuitable for production. So the only remaining area of land of any size left, which would be suitable for agriculture, is shown coloured in green, covering Africa, the Middle East, and through into India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. And that's the area that's used for forests at present. So if we want to increase agricultural land, we need to use land that's currently used for forests. And if we look at this chart, which actually shows actual changes in land use, and just focus on the totals for the world between 1990 and 2007, that when there's been an increase in agricultural land use, generally there's a decrease in the area of forest. However, this sort of use of land has many complex issues associated with it. So if we look at just one example from Indonesia, in the second half of the 20th century, 1/3 of Indonesian forests were cut down, usually to provide plantations for growth of palm oil production. So what's the problem with this? Well, one issue is that Indonesia, despite only having 1.3% of the world's land area, actually has a large proportion of the world's plant, animal, bird species, and in particular 10% of all mammal species occur in Indonesia and mainly live in forests. So if we cut down forests, we reduce biodiversity and environment available for animals. So many people then say, well, the problem is palm oil and cutting down forests, so we must stop using palm oil. However, the problem is palm oil is a very productive crop. We can get 3.3 tons of oil from 1 hectare. If we change to using other types of oil, such as rapeseed oil, sunflower oil, we only get 0.7 tons. So if we wanted to stop making palm oil, start using rapeseed or sunflower, we would actually need 5 times the area of forest to be cut down to provide the same crop. So there are many complex impacts of crop production, which this diagram is attempting to summarize. But basically, we can say that if we have a natural ecosystem, it's generally good for things like water, air quality, biodiversity. Whereas if we have a monoculture crop production, it generally has adverse effects on these aspects of the environment, although it's very good for crop production. And one striking number which summarizes this is the biomass of mammals that are alive on Earth. So 60% of the biomass of all mammals is made up of farm animals. Another third is humans, and only 4% is wild animals. So if we increase the area of forest, we will impact this small area that's left over for use of wild animals. So increasing the area of farmland is going to have adverse effects on forests, environment, and animals. So what about other methods of increasing production? And this is where agriculture and climate change come together. So I'm sure you're aware, greenhouse gases from human activities are now linked to climate change. I won't go through the detail of this, but in August of this year, an intergovernmental panel concluded that almost certainly there's 1 degree Celsius rise in average surface temperature that's been observed is linked to the increase in greenhouse gas production since 1950. As you can see, greenhouse gas production increased gradually from the beginning of industrialization, but since the 1950s, there's been a much more rapid increase, and there is now a corresponding increase in average temperatures. So what's the connection of that and agriculture? Well, the problem is that current agriculture and food production makes about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions, and clearly that in itself is not sustainable. So that's existing methods of agriculture. Now, you might think some of or most of that comes from transport, since products are made in one country often and then shipped to another country for consumption. But transport is only about 1.6% of the total. Mostly it's from loss of forest, but a large proportion is from the methods used for agriculture production currently. And of course, this has come to the attention of climate activists such as Greta Thunberg, who you may remember is the Swedish schoolgirl who led many protests calling for government change. And more recently, she's been urging change in food production. But other organizations such as the Worldwide Fund for Nature is now focusing on agriculture as a cause of climate change and loss of animal and plant diversity. So WWF says it's no longer working simply on saving species and landscapes, i.e. establishing nature reserves isn't enough. It needs to have changes in the way that we impact on the environment if we are going to preserve the natural environment and animal diversity. If we look in more detail at agriculture, different sorts of agriculture have different levels of impact, but probably the highest impact comes from meat production. As you can see, all these methods of meat production produce many more kilos of carbon dioxide gases for every kilogram of food produced. So for every kilogram of beef produced, there is almost 100 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So cattle are the bad boys of agriculture in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And they have other impacts. So it's inefficient feeding crops to cattle that leads to more emissions. Demand for pasture, particularly in South America, has led to deforestation in the Amazon basin and so on. So one of the main problems with cattle is that Unlike humans, they have a more complex digestive system. So they have an extra area before the regular stomach called the rumen, and within that, microbes digest the grass, which humans can't digest. So the grass that cows and sheep and goats eat is digested by microbes, which unfortunately some of them produce methane. And cows produce almost 400 litres of methane every day, and methane is a greenhouse gas like carbon dioxide. So if we're going to increase yield of food using existing production methods, that's also going to impact the environment because it will lead to increased greenhouse gas emissions, and already the emissions from farming are too high and need to be reduced. So what sort of innovations can we make to meet these challenges? So as I've explained, agriculture has enormous impact on the world. We don't have time today to go through this in detail, but I've mentioned some of the impacts that agriculture land use has. Existing methods to increase production both have negative aspects. So generally, the conclusion of most people is that in order to feed an increased number of people without using more land, since that would have extreme impact on many aspects of the environment, we need to use existing methods to improve productivity, but at the same time to lower emissions of greenhouse gases. And I just want to briefly mention in the few minutes that I hope remain for me of improving innovations which have been proposed to improve production whilst at the same time reducing emissions. So this can include things like reducing nitrous oxide emissions from crop plants. So although nitrogen fertilizers have been very successful in feeding us and improving productivity, they also cause pollution in the form of nitrous oxide. 7% of all greenhouse gas production in the USA comes from nitrous oxide, and most of that is from agricultural use of ammonium nitrogen-based fertilizers. So if you supply more nitrogen than the crop plants can use, the excess is converted into nitrous oxides, which are released into the atmosphere. So in order to improve that, you need a more active management of the fertilizer. So you need to only apply your fertilizer when crops are actually growing, and you only need to give just enough fertilizer that ensures a high yield, but not an excess. So use of new technology in the form of things like drones can help with monitoring the crop growth, such as here, and only applying fertilizer and spraying in areas where the yield or the crop isn't growing so well, and not in areas where it's not required. We can also try reducing food losses and wastage. 6% of greenhouse gas emissions come from food loss and waste. That's in the food processing, distribution, and waste by consumers. An example of this is in bananas, which are often transported long distances, and bananas release a gas, ethylene gas, which causes ripening of the fruit. So if one or two bananas in a cargo release their ethylene gas, it can spoil many of the bananas because they ripen too soon and are no longer usable. And usually up to 15% of the crop is lost in this way. So scientists are looking at using genetic engineering methods to reduce the level of ethylene production to preserve the bananas for longer. It may be possible even to develop carbon neutral cows. So cows obviously a large problem, and there are many different ways being looked at to develop it. Some of them aren't particularly require high technology. It can be as simple as planting trees in pasture land can improve productivity so the cows grow in 2 rather than 3 years and only therefore produce 2/3 of the methane. Other methods look at actually reducing methane production through genetics or developing vaccines to stop the 3% of the microbes which are responsible for the methane production. Some methods of farming may even be carbon negative. So due to overfishing of wild fish, Fish farming is often used as a replacement, and fish farming has really taken off greatly, whilst wild caught fish has more or less stabilised. However, fish farming is not always so environmentally friendly, as fish feeds often from wild caught fish. Fish farms can impact the local environment. One form of aquaculture, though, which seems to be more environmentally friendly, is shellfish farming. So here we have Pacific green mussels, which can be farmed. So as all you see above the water, the mussels are below, usually attached to long lines and ropes. And shellfish farming has low inputs, can improve the water quality, and is carbon negative because the shellfish capture calcium carbonate from the seawater, which ultimately came from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and they capture it in the form of calcium carbonate, which is what they use to make the hard shell on the outside of the shellfish. So to summarize, as I've explained, an increased population in the world needs more food, but we can only increase food production by increasing use of agricultural land, which would destroy forests. Therefore, really, agriculture needs to be more productive. But existing methods of agriculture make agriculture a major producer of greenhouse gases. Therefore, what we really need is sustainable agriculture to increase productivity and decrease greenhouse gas emissions. So what we need is high yield, low emission agriculture. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that you have learned something from this talk. And if you have any questions about it, please put the questions in the Q&A box and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you.